Lewis Hamilton arrived at the Circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya not just as a seven-time world champion, but as a force of nature, a driver whose very presence on the track could shift the psychological balance of the entire paddock. This was not a Grand Prix weekend. There were no tens of thousands of fans waving British flags, no deafening anthems, no champagne-soaked celebrations awaiting him at the finish line. But none of that mattered. The track was still his battleground, and any session, no matter how insignificant it seemed on paper, was an opportunity to assert dominance, to remind the world, and more importantly, his rivals, that his hunger had not faded. The air was thick with tension, an almost tangible energy pulsing through the circuit as Hamilton stepped into the garage. Every mechanic, every engineer, every observer knew that something special was about to unfold. The silver Mercedes stood gleaming under the fluorescent lights, an apex predator waiting to be unleashed. Hamilton's eyes scanned the monitors, his mind already 3 steps ahead, dissecting every detail, analyzing every variable. His racing suit bore the battle scars of countless victories, and his helmet, adorned with symbols of triumph, was a stark reminder that he had conquered circuits, seasons, and skeptics alike. But this was no ordinary day of testing. Across the paddock, Ferrari had arrived with intent. The Scuderia had brought with them a sense of resurgence, a quiet but unmistakable confidence that had been missing in recent years. The SF-24 had been turning heads all morning, its scarlet body slicing through the corners with an elegance that suggested something more than just incremental improvement. And at the heart of this effort was Charles Leclerc, a driver with raw speed, relentless determination, and an unshakable belief that this could finally be his moment. The whispers had already started. Engineers exchanged knowing glances, journalists scribbled feverishly in their notebooks, social media buzzed with speculation. Was this the year Ferrari finally put Mercedes on the back foot? Had they found the secret formula to unsettle the reigning kings of Formula One? The stopwatch seemed to suggest so. Leclerc had been relentless, pushing his machine to the limit, extracting every ounce of performance as the lap times tumbled. Hamilton, however, remained unbothered. He had seen this story unfold before. He knew how easily optimism could inflate in pre-season and private tests. He had watched teams convince themselves they had closed the gap, only for reality to hit like a sledgehammer when the season truly began. And today, he had no intention of letting Ferrari, or Leclerc, walk away from this session with a sense of superiority. As he pulled his gloves tight and climbed into the cockpit, a familiar smirk played on his lips. He relished these moments, the unspoken duels, the psychological warfare waged through sheer performance. The garage doors opened, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath as the Mercedes roared to life. The sound was not just mechanical, it was a statement, a war cry that echoed through the grandstands. On the other side of the track, Leclerc caught the noise and instinctively glanced at the screens. He knew what was coming. The silent battle was about to commence. Hamilton rolled out of the pit lane with precision, each movement a blend of artistry and aggression. The first few laps were reconnaissance, feeling out the balance, analyzing the grip levels. Then, without warning, he flicked the switch. The lap times began to drop. The telemetry told a story of a man who had just decided it was time to remind everyone who he was. Leclerc, watching from his own garage, clenched his fists. This was no longer a simple test session. This was a message. And he had no choice but to respond. As the hours ticked by, the track remained a battlefield of patience, calculation, and relentless precision. The day had been dictated by discipline, lap after lap of methodical data gathering, carefully managed race simulations, the drivers restrained by the invisible chains of strategy. Heavy fuel loads, tire wear management, engine mode restrictions. No one was pushing. No one was revealing their true pace. This was not about glory, it was about preparation. And yet, beneath the surface, tension brewed. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew the real fight hadn't even begun. But as the sun dipped lower, casting an ethereal golden glow over the Circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya, something changed. The track had finally settled into its optimal state. The sweltering afternoon heat had faded, leaving behind a surface primed for ultimate grip. The wind, which had been unpredictable throughout the day, had died down, stabilizing the car's behavior through the high-speed corners. The conditions were as close to perfection as they would ever be. And Lewis Hamilton knew it. Then, the radio crackled to life. The moment of truth had arrived. Box this lap. Soft tires going on. It was a simple instruction, but the implications were seismic. The tone of the session was about to shift, drastically. This was no longer about endurance, no longer about restraint. This was about sending a message. This was about raw speed. Hamilton didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had heard those words 1,000 times before. He knew exactly what they meant. Guiding the car into the pit lane, he was met by a pit crew that operated with machine-like precision. Every movement was rehearsed, every action executed with the urgency of a championship-deciding moment. The old tires were ripped off in an instant, the fresh, soft compound Pirellis locked into place. A final adjustment to the front wing. A last check of telemetry. Then, a nod from his race engineer. And just like that, he was released. Rolling out of the pits, Hamilton was not just another driver on track. He was a predator entering the hunt. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. Every input was deliberate, every movement an exercise in calculated aggression. He began weaving subtly, generating heat into the fresh rubber, ensuring they reached the optimal temperature window. The car was alive beneath him, the steering wheel transmitting the finest details of the asphalt's texture into his fingertips. Every bump, every camber change, every shift in grip was absorbed into his consciousness. He wasn't just driving the car, he was becoming one with it. As he approached the final corners before launching into his flying lap, his breathing slowed. His pulse steadied. His grip on the wheel was firm, yet effortless. In that moment, there was no past, no future, only the absolute present. He took one final deep breath, exhaled, and then he unleashed hell. The moment he crossed the start-finish line, it was as if the laws of physics had been rewritten. The car, now in its most aggressive low-fuel high-attack mode, surged forward with unrelenting force. He rocketed into turn 1, braking at the absolute last possible millisecond, the car dancing on the knife's edge between perfection and catastrophe. The tires, barely warmed, bit into the asphalt with ferocity, and Hamilton wasted no time exploiting every ounce of available grip. Turn 3, full throttle. The car balanced on a razor's edge, tires clawing at the surface as he committed to a line so precise it defied belief. Any lesser driver would have lifted. Hamilton? He went even faster. Through the high-speed sweeps, his focus was otherworldly. His hands moved with the precision of a virtuoso pianist, his feet modulating throttle and brake inputs with the perfection of a seasoned fighter pilot guiding a missile at supersonic speeds. His mind processed information at an unfathomable rate, sector times, brake balance adjustments, wind direction shifts, all being computed in real time. Every corner was a battle against the limits of adhesion, yet he never once flinched. The car twitched violently on the exit of turn 9, just for a fraction of a second, but Hamilton's reflexes were already ahead of the moment. A minuscule correction, a near-invisible countersteer, and the Mercedes snapped back into perfect alignment. It was the kind of moment that separated the great from the truly legendary. Sector 2, purple. Sector 3 approached, the final test. The hardest braking zones, the slowest corners, where hundredths of a second were either gained or lost in an instant. Hamilton was ruthless. No mercy for the track limits, no hesitation. He extracted every possible fraction of speed from the car, throwing it into each apex with an audacity that defied reason. The final chicane, a delicate balancing act of brute force and finesse, was executed flawlessly. And then the final straight. Hamilton buried the throttle. The engine roared in fury. The speedometer climbed, the finish line now hurtling toward him. And in that last millisecond before he crossed it, he knew. He had just set the fastest lap of the session. The radio burst to life. P1. Purple lap. Fastest of the day. No reaction from Hamilton. No celebration. He simply exhaled, barely blinking, already analyzing where he could have gone even faster. The job wasn't done. Not yet. But for the rest of the paddock? They had just been given a warning. The world held its breath. The Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One car sat on the edge of the track, poised like a coiled predator, its turbocharged hybrid engine growling with barely restrained fury. This was not just a machine, it was a weapon of speed, a testament to human engineering pushed to the very brink of what was scientifically possible. Then, in an instant, all hell broke loose. Hamilton floored the throttle, and the car responded with a savage explosion of raw power, launching itself forward like a missile breaking free from Earth's gravitational pull. The sheer violence of acceleration was enough to snap a lesser driver's neck. The G-forces slammed his body against the cockpit with unrelenting force, his helmeted head jerking backward as the car surged past 100 kilometers per hour in the blink of an eye. But Hamilton was no ordinary man. He was forged for this. Born to defy the laws of physics. The needle on the speedometer climbed at an astonishing rate, 200 kilometers per hour, 250 kilometers per hour, 300 km/h. And still, he kept his foot buried into the carbon fiber monocoque, pushing the car beyond the limits of reason. The track surface beneath him blurred into an indistinguishable ribbon of asphalt, the barriers on either side reduced to mere streaks of color. The engine screamed with mechanical fury, a deafening wail that reverberated through every grandstand, sending shockwaves through the eardrums of anyone foolish enough to stand without ear protection. And then, with a flick of his thumb, Hamilton activated the drag reduction system, DRS. Instantly, the rear wing flaps snapped open, eliminating precious downforce but unleashing the full force of his machine's unbridled speed. The car didn't just accelerate, it rocketed forward like an intercontinental ballistic missile, cutting through the dense Spanish air at a mind-melting 327 kilometers per hour. The crowd gasped. This was insane. This was beyond human. Turn 1 approached, a brutal high-speed braking zone that had humbled even the greatest drivers in history. It was a place where bravery and foolishness were separated by mere milliseconds. But Hamilton wasn't just brave, he was a master. A cold-blooded executioner of precision. He refused to brake. The grandstands watched in disbelief. This was suicide. Every driver before him had lifted off the throttle long before this point, their survival instincts taking over. But Hamilton? No. He kept his foot planted, defying every natural law. He was staring death in the face and laughing. Only at the very last possible moment, when physics itself demanded submission, did he stomp on the brake pedal with the precision of a neurosurgeon's scalpel. The car screamed in protest, the tires locking for a fraction of a second before the ABS system saved them from complete annihilation. The downforce pinned him to the seat with such brutal force that it felt as though his ribcage would collapse under the pressure. The seatbelts dug into his shoulders like vices, the very air inside the cockpit thick with the scent of burning rubber and hot carbon fiber. The car twitched. A lesser driver would have lost it. A lesser driver would have ended up in the gravel, humiliated, defeated. But not Hamilton. He adjusted the steering by mere millimeters that made the difference between glory and catastrophe. And the car obeyed, slicing through Turn 1 with the grace of a heat-seeking missile locked onto its target. Turn 2 arrived before he could blink. No time to rest. No time to breathe. The car was a living, breathing organism beneath him, shifting its weight, adjusting its balance with every split-second input he gave it. The rear end wanted to step out. It begged for mercy, sliding ever so slightly, but Hamilton held it steady, wrestling the beast into submission without even flinching. And then, Turn 3. The monster. The ultimate test of courage. This was the infamous right-hander that separated the great from the gods. This was where only the bravest souls dared to go flat out, where the line between hero and tragedy was thinner than a strand of hair. This was where the car's downforce had to be absolute, where commitment had to be total, where weakness was punished with ferocity. Would he lift? Not a chance. Hamilton stayed on the throttle. Flat. Out. The G-forces slammed into his body like a freight train, pressing him so violently into his seat that his vision blurred for a fraction of a second. The car held, just barely, hugging the racing line as if it were attached by an invisible thread. One mistake here, one miscalculation, and he would be launched into the barriers at over 290 kilometers per hour, a passenger in his own destruction. But Hamilton didn't make mistakes. Turn 4 was next, the deceptive left-hander that had ruined the dreams of so many hopefuls. Brake too late, and you were sent into the abyss. Brake too early, and you might as well hand over the championship. The balance had to be divine, the precision godlike. Hamilton hit his marks with flawless execution, his braking so perfectly timed that it felt preordained by fate itself. The car rotated like it was being guided by unseen hands, and as he powered out of the corner, the throttle was applied with the smoothness of an artist brushing paint onto a masterpiece. This wasn't just a lap. This wasn't just racing. This was Hamilton proving, yet again, that he was not just a driver. He was a force of nature. An unstoppable storm. A legend in motion. The descent into Turn 5 was more than just a technical challenge. It was a battlefield, a brutal test of nerve, skill, and sheer instinct. The steep drop meant that any misjudgment, any fraction of overcommitment, could result in catastrophic understeer, sending the car wide and destroying an otherwise immaculate lap. But Lewis Hamilton? He wasn't just driving. He was sculpting the perfect lap with the precision of a master craftsman. His foot feathered the throttle with almost supernatural finesse, a fraction of a degree dictating the exact amount of grip needed to keep the rear in check. The engine roared beneath him, a mechanical beast barely contained, desperate to break loose. But Hamilton held it in submission, an untamed predator bending to his absolute will. As he exited the corner, the car catapulted forward, the acceleration so ferocious it seemed as if the laws of physics had been rewritten just for him. Every millisecond counted, every shift in weight a calculated move in the game of milliseconds. The G-forces slammed him into his seat, his vision narrowing, the world around him dissolving into a tunnel of pure speed. And then, without even a moment to breathe, he launched into the treacherous sequence of turns 6, 7, and 8, a gauntlet that separated the elite from the merely excellent. Here, the car danced on the razor's edge of adhesion, every ounce of grip exploited to its absolute limit. Lesser drivers hesitated here, afraid of unsettling the balance, but Hamilton attacked it like a predator on the hunt. Each curb was devoured with precision, every apex clipped with the meticulousness of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. The weight transfer was seamless, as if the car were an extension of his own body, the suspension compressing and releasing in perfect harmony with his input. His hands barely moved, only the slightest corrections necessary, proof that he was not reacting to the car, he was anticipating it. It was otherworldly. And then came the behemoth. Turn 9. The corner of courage. A place where even the greatest felt their pulse quicken, where champions questioned their own mortality. The entry speed was absurd, borderline impossible. This was a section where others might lift, even for a split second, a flicker of doubt creeping into their mind. But Hamilton? He never lifted. Not even a millimeter. Foot planted, full commitment, absolute trust in his own reflexes and the machine beneath him. The rear snapped violently, protesting against the absurd forces at play, but he tamed it with a barely perceptible flick of the wheel, an instinctual countersteer executed with a kind of precision that defied human reaction time. The car wobbled for a fraction of a second, then it was rock solid again, and he was gone, rocketing down the back straight at a velocity that seemed to defy reason. The track blurred past as he reached the braking zone for turn 10, a sector where lap time could vanish in an instant if not approached with absolute mastery. This was where bravery met intelligence, where aggression had to be tempered with finesse. The braking force was monstrous, the deceleration brutal enough to crush lesser men. But Hamilton wasn't just a driver, he was a warrior in the cockpit. His braking point was impossibly late, so late that it seemed as if he had momentarily forgotten the concept of stopping. Yet, at the exact moment where disaster seemed inevitable, he flicked the car into rotation with an elegance that should have been impossible at such an absurd entry speed. The tires clawed at the tarmac, screaming in protest but obeying his command. No slide, no overcorrection, just an ice-cold execution of a perfect maneuver. He was in complete control, threading the needle between risk and reward with the precision of an assassin. Every motion was intentional, every microsecond accounted for. He wasn't just fast, he was transcendent. The final sector loomed, a treacherous stretch where time could be lost in an instant and legends could be made. This was the moment of truth. Every apex, every braking zone, every throttle input had to be perfect. There was no margin for error, no second chances. But Hamilton had no doubts, no hesitation. He was operating on a level beyond what most could comprehend, a state of flow so deep it bordered on clairvoyance. He wasn't just driving the car, he was one with it. And then, in a flash, the lap was complete. The pit wall erupted. The crowd stood in stunned silence before exploding into cheers. The stopwatch told the story, the fastest lap of the day. A lap for the ages. A lap that would be replayed, analyzed, and remembered as a testament to the absolute peak of human and mechanical synergy. This wasn't just driving. This was something else. Something greater. Lewis Hamilton had just rewritten what was possible on 4 wheels. Turn 11, flawless. Not just a clean execution, but an absolute masterclass in precision. The way the car responded to his touch was not just mechanical, it was instinctive, like an extension of his own will. The rear tires held the perfect slip angle, the front end bit into the apex with surgical accuracy, and in a fraction of a second, he was gone. The steering wheel twitched in his grip as he corrected, not out of error, but out of mastery. He was operating on a level beyond comprehension. The world outside blurred, the screaming engine drowning out everything except the relentless focus inside the cockpit. Turn 12, violent yet calculated. This was the moment that separated the elite from the legends. Most drivers feared it, their reflexes hesitating for the slightest fraction of a second. But Hamilton? He welcomed it. He threw the car into the corner with an aggression that should have sent him spinning into the barriers, but instead, the machine responded with perfect obedience. It was an act of defiance against physics itself. And then the chicane. The most complex, the most demanding sequence on the track. A place where races were won or lost. A place where champions either thrived or crumbled. And Hamilton? He danced across the curbs with a perfection that defied belief. The suspension compressed and rebounded like a well-rehearsed symphony, the car floating over the jagged edges as if they weren't even there. Each movement was deliberate, each action part of an unspoken language between man and machine. There was no wasted motion. No unnecessary adjustments. Just absolute control. The final stretch. The last test. The moment that would separate this lap from every other lap that had ever been driven on this circuit. The last corner. An enigma of raw speed and absolute precision. The car, balanced on the razor's edge, was pushed to its limits. The throttle pinned. The rear tires begging for mercy. And then boom. He was gone. A rocket, a missile, a force of nature unleashed down the main straight with all the fury of a storm. The crowd, the engineers, the rivals, they watched in stunned silence. The line approached. The digital clocks froze. Fastest lap. Not just by a margin, by a chasm. A gap so large, so incomprehensible, that it sent shockwaves through the entire paddock. The telemetry didn't just show a quick lap, it displayed dominance. The kind of dominance that breaks spirits. That crushes hope. That sends a message that cannot be ignored. Hamilton did not react. There was no celebratory fist pump, no yell of triumph over the radio. He simply drove back into the pits, as if he had just completed a mundane outlap. But those who knew him, those who had seen this look before, understood what it meant. He parked. The engine shut down. Silence. He removed his gloves with the same methodical precision that he had used to navigate the circuit. The helmet came off. And then the first glimpse of emotion, a smirk. Not arrogance, not cockiness. Just a quiet, knowing expression that spoke volumes. And then, without hesitation, he walked. Not towards the engineers. Not towards the debrief. Not towards the data screens where his lap time flashed in glowing digits, a testament to his brilliance. He walked towards the Ferrari garage. A move so bold, so unexpected, that the entire paddock seemed to hold its breath. The moment he stepped inside enemy territory, the atmosphere changed. Conversations halted. Mechanics froze. Engineers turned their heads, sensing the shift in energy. This was not a friendly visit. This was not small talk. This was a message. Frédéric Vasseur, Ferrari's team principal, stood in front of the monitors, his gaze fixed on the data. But when Hamilton approached, he looked up. There was no hiding it, the unspoken tension. Hamilton met his gaze, unshaken, unfazed. What time did Charles do? His voice, steady. Measured. Lethal in its simplicity. Vasseur hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty. Just for a moment. But it was enough. 1 second slower than you. Silence. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. Hamilton absorbed them, not with satisfaction, but with inevitability. As if he had known all along. As if the entire paddock had known all along. And then the smirk returned. Sharper now, more defined. He leaned in slightly, his voice low, deliberate. Well, remember that, he said, his tone like ice. Because it's going to be like this all year. No further theatrics. No need for extra words. The damage had been done. He turned, walking away with the confidence of a man who had already won the psychological war before the season had even begun. Behind him, Ferrari's garage remained frozen in silence. The engineers, the mechanics, the strategists, all left staring at the screens that told a story no one wanted to admit. The legend of Lewis Hamilton had just added another chapter. And the rest of the grid? They had just been put on notice.